Anglo-Russian relations throughout history, if you look back to the 16th century, have always been tricky for one reason or another. But the Cold War was a very special time. I mean, it was a Cold War, but it was a sort of war. There was a lot of hostility on both sides, and the importance of having an embassy there at that time was that, first of all, we need to try and form some idea of what was going on inside the Soviet Union, although our ideas were mostly wrong, in my view. But we also needed to have a channel of communication available which could be used when necessary to try and avoid things getting even worse. And, of course, there were better periods, the whole period when we were negotiating arms agreements, test ban treaty, and things like that. And in earlier periods, there was the Second World War when we were allies. We were rather touchy allies, tricky allies, but we needed an embassy then. One does need embassies even nowadays because it's a myth that prime ministers can ring up their dear friend Vlad and sort it all out on the telephone. That's not what happens.
What about after the demise of the USSR, when you were ambassador? How did they change?
Well, I think that's something which is often forgotten in Russia and even here. At the end of the Soviet Union and the first few years of Russia, there was a very strong wave of warm goodwill in Britain towards the people of that country, of hope that their lives would improve, both the economics and the politics, that they would become part of the wider world. Russians would be able to travel, we'd be able to travel to Russia, and that the barriers which had been set up by the Cold War would all be diminished. And that was a genuine feeling. Russians don't believe that, of course. They think that we were out to get them throughout. But that wasn't true, actually. And the aid and advice that was given was mostly genuinely meant. Of course, it was hugely condescending, misplaced, and infuriating if you were a Russian. I would have hated to be at the receiving end of it. And I did have an experience when I went to tell a deputy foreign minister at the end of 1991, when Russia was in a very bad state, that we were going to provide a whole lot of aid, but we were not going to deliver it to the central government because they're all communists and we didn't trust them. We were going to deliver it direct to local administrations, which weren't communist and wouldn't be corrupt. And this man said, he was very, very nice about it. He said, of course we're grateful for all this stuff. Of course we are. We're in a bad way. But you do realize what a humiliation it is for us, don't you? And I don't think people in the West did understand what a humiliation it was, and still don't. That a lot of the problems in Russia today and in the relation between Russia and the West today stems from that period of humiliation.
It seems that ties between Moscow and London ebb and flow. There sometimes is a kind of rapprochement, there's business interests that it strengthen. At other times it feels that relationships are at an all-time low. How do you view ties now, and how do you view how, say, the Western media in general and the British media in particular portray Russia?
Well, I think, as you say, that the relationships ebb and flow. In the 80s and early 90s, the political relationship was rather good. Relationship between the leaders, between Gorbachev and Yeltsin and British leaders, was rather a good one, and there was this wave of goodwill, as I said. I think that it's gone downhill since then, and it's not very good now. There are lots of reasons for that, the Litvinenko case and so on. My own view is that the press are very quick to report bad news from Russia and not very good at reporting the good news, some of which is rather complicated. There are lots of positive things going on in Russia, in the regions and in, for example, the social services and so on, which are not the sort of exciting things that journalists want to report. So you do get a rather one-sided picture. It doesn't mean to say that all the bad news they report doesn't exist. There is bad news coming out of Russia, but they don't balance it, in my view, with the good news and the changes and the progress that's being made.
So when they talk about poor ties between Moscow and London, that is, the media report on poor ties or bad ties, do you believe that?
I don't think the relationship is very good, partly because when you look at it, the need of the two countries for one another is not very high and never has been. I mean, during the war, of course, we were allies, and during the Cold War we were sort of enemies, and that was important. But Russia has never been the country which Britain looks to first and foremost as its main partner. It's the West European countries and the United States, and Russia is further away, and vice versa, I think. The relationship is a fragile one. That means it can go up and down in different ways from the way in which, for example, the relationship between Russia and Germany goes up and down.